Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. First, I want to say thanks to everyone who's been watching my videos. So last year I started school, so I'm back in grad school. I work full-time and I'm in grad school for data science now, which is something I absolutely love and I'm just thrilled to have found as my calling. But I started my YouTube channel over the holiday break when I had lots of time to work on videos. And now that school's back in session, I'm having a little bit of trouble balancing my full-time job, my full-time studies, and trying to do YouTube videos, which is also very important to me. So I will be finished with school this coming December in 2022. And until then, my videos may be a little bit slow going, but after that, I think I'll be able to pick back up because I really enjoy making them. And honestly, there are just so many stories out there in the world that need to be told in long form so that people know them. The case we're going to be talking about today is completely and utterly heartbreaking, and it's also extremely disturbing. I will be honest with you all. I am a person who is very comfortable with reading about dark things that have happened in the world. Like many people, I had a lot of trauma and loss in my childhood, so I'm no stranger to those concepts in my personal life. And really, nothing shocks me at all. I haven't been shocked in a long time. But this case was really hard for me to finish researching because I so badly wanted it to end completely differently. And it just doesn't. This case is about as bad as it gets in every way. It's violent, it's gruesome, and it has just completely ruined a family. And so I just want to let you know that before we start talking about the case. If you don't want to hear about domestic violence or murder, particularly an extremely grisly murder, please go ahead and click out of the video. I completely understand. The last thing I ever want to do in my videos is re-traumatize or trigger someone. I don't wish to harm anyone in that way. So I totally understand. Maybe you can come back another time and see if I've talked about a different case that maybe you're a little more comfortable with. If you do want to hear the story, I will go ahead and get started. So this is a case that takes place in China in the year 2020. It was covered in the international media. The Guardian covered it, The Independent covered it, the New York Times and CNN both covered it a little bit. But the full story has not been told in video form yet. And so that's why I want to talk about it today. So this is Lamo. Lamo was a farmer from Tibet, and she was born on March 3rd, 1990.
今天我站在马尔康市的半山上，我给你们看一下马尔康市有多大啊！你们看见了吗？这个就是马尔康市，它特别长。
Lamo was not her real name. Her real name was either Amuchu or Amumu. I'm not sure, and I'm so sorry if I'm saying it incorrectly. I read both of those names, but Lamo was her name on TikTok. She was a very famous social media star in China, and she loved posting on TikTok. And her name on TikTok was Lamo. And so I will be referring to her as Lamo in this video.
朋友们，我终于又翻了一个垭口，但是还要翻几个垭口才能到家里面。为了晚上赶路，我在车子上睡一会儿。因为这里的路太不好了。这里有个小溪，我在这里洗了个脸，因为从昨晚上到现在还没有休息，在车子里去休息一下，把车门锁好，这样将就休息一下，等一下继续赶路。
Lamo lived in southwestern Sichuan province in China in a village called Engawa. Engawa is the Tibetan name for this village. The Chinese name of the village is Aba. Lama was born into poverty. She didn't complete school past primary school, and so she wasn't very literate. She could read, but only a little bit. She had a sister named Dolma who was 4 years older than her, and Dolma had a son and a daughter. Her son was actually really close with his aunt Lamo, closer to her than he was to his own mother, Dolma. Dolma actually didn't go to school at all. She grew up herding sheep. Lamo and Dolma's father's name is Saburo Jia, and he's Tibetan, and he only speaks Tibetan. He doesn't speak Mandarin. Dolma described Lamo as being happy and optimistic as a child. Dolma has said many wonderful things about Lamo. She was just a wonderful sister to have. She would always share everything she had with Dolma. But it sounded like they had a really happy childhood together as sisters. And Lamo's cousin describes Lamo as having been lively with a big smile. As you can see, Lamo absolutely loved posting these wonderful videos on TikTok, and I'm going to get to that subject soon. So, Lamo and her father picked herbs in the mountains for a living, medicinal herbs.
今天我才发现了一件事情，在海拔3000米以上的话，这个菖蒲的根部很短，而且颜色偏黑，不像那个海拔4000米以上的菖蒲，它们俩区别很大哦。
This is a family tradition for them, and it's very difficult work. So they would go up into the mountains for days at a time. They would have to make a shelter, and they would have to figure out what to eat and dig in the ground for these herbs, and then transport them all back to the village. And I will get back to that later too.
今天我爬的是观音庙的对面，我带你们看一下，这的风景更美了。在这儿的树全部都变黄了，在蓝天白云下是神圣的观音庙。朋友们说我的手势不对，这样对了吗？下面的话是观音镇，再过来的话是永中儿家老师的老家，你们看见了吗？那里有个湖，它正在开发旅游。这么美的风景。我已经爬到了山顶，正在吃中午饭了。今天我带的是酥油饼，真的挺好吃的。
When Lamo was 17 or 18 years old, she met a boy from a neighboring village, and this boy's name was Lu Tong. First name Lu, family name Tong. Every article about this case refers to him as Tong, T-A-N-G, so I'm going to refer to him as Tong. And by the way, this is the only picture that's out there of Tong. So soon after Tong and Lamo met, they got married. And actually, very quickly after that, Lamo got pregnant and gave birth to their first son in 2008. Now, Tong was not very highly educated either. He actually dropped out of school after junior high. And for a while, it said that he ran a van. I'm not sure what that means, if it means he gave people rides in a van or transported goods in a van or something like that, maybe both. But at some point, Tong's parents sold some of their land and they used the money to open a tea house. And the tea house was actually quite lucrative for them. And they would actually just pay for Tong's living expenses. He didn't have to work anymore after they opened this tea house. But Lamo, when she wasn't working in the mountains with her father, she would actually work at the tea house. So soon after they married, Tong began physically abusing Lamo. And it started off relatively small. That's not to say that any domestic abuse or any kind of abuse is okay. It's not. But it started off a little bit smaller. And Dolma, Lamo's sister, would sometimes notice that Lamo's face looked kind of red and swollen and maybe a little bit bruised. But the only thing that Lamo told Dolma was that Tong had slapped her once. Now, Lamo and Dolma's mother, whose name I couldn't find in my research, was an absolutely amazing woman. She was extremely highly skilled. She was great at finding the medicinal herbs in the mountains. She was a phenomenal cook, and she was great at knitting and sewing clothing, and she was just the backbone of the family. She was really the dominant parent and the dominant force in the household when Lamo and Dolma were growing up. So their mother was actually so amazing that she was kind of intimidating to Tong. Tong was a little bit afraid of her. And so during this time in Lamo's life, Tong wasn't quite as abusive as he's going to get later because he was afraid of Lamo's mother, because Lamo's mother would actually stick up for her. Unfortunately, in 2011, Lamo's mother was diagnosed with advanced gallbladder cancer, and the family didn't have money for her to get chemo, so she ended up dying the next year in 2012. After Lamo's mother died, Tong's abuse started to really escalate because there was no one around to protect her the way her mother had. Every time he would hit Lamo, he would apologize profusely. He would even get down on his knees and say he was so sorry and he would never do it again. And at this point, Lama was still really young, and she was very forgiving of him. You know, she believed that Tong would try to be a better person, especially for the sake of their son. But as is usually the case, Tong never stopped abusing Lamo. And in fact, his abuse escalated to the point where he would do it in public. So one time, Lamo and Tong were at this spring festival party. I think it was in like one of the little shops or some little building downtown in their village. And Tong grabbed Lamo by the hair and pulled her out onto the street and punched her in the eyes, right there in front of everyone. When Tong would physically abuse Lamo, she would go to her father's house to recover. And sometimes she'd go to another relative's house. But every time she left, Tong would follow her. And her relatives really didn't stick up for her because, first of all, they were afraid that if they did that, that he was just going to abuse Lamo even more. And secondly, of course, they were afraid of Tong themselves. So Lamo was really quite defenseless. And over time, the family noticed that Lamo smiled less and less. She just didn't have the same happy personality that she'd had as a child. This abuse was really taking a toll on her. In 2016, Lamo got pregnant again and gave birth to their second son. Now, during this time, Lamo started going to the police about Tong's abuse. And I'm not sure exactly how many times she went, but it was more than once. But every time she went, they would tell her that there was really nothing they could do because it was a family matter. It was a family issue. Wasn't an issue for them to solve. Wasn't an issue for them to intervene in to try to protect Lamo. It was her problem. By 2018, Lamo had been suffering this abuse for an entire decade. She was only 28 years old, but she'd been abused constantly since she was 18. And she desperately needed an escape because she was just feeling more and more depressed. So she started posting on TikTok. Now, TikTok in China is called Douyin, and it's the same thing as our TikTok in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It's just that the Chinese version stores videos on a different server because they have to comply with Chinese censorship laws. If you want to watch Lamo's videos, what you have to do is download Douyin, which you can find pretty easily. It's not in the Google Play Store or the Apple Store. You have to just find it in your browser and download it and install it. And then you have to translate Lamo's name into Chinese characters, which is just two characters. It's actually Lamo in Mandarin. And then you have to copy those two characters and paste them into Douyin, and then you will find her. She was also very proud of her Tibetan heritage, and she loved showing off the beautiful traditional Tibetan clothing that she had.
武汉加油，中国加油！我是来自阿坝州的藏族姑娘，我叫周马拉姆，我们一起加油！
She would take her audience into the mountains with her and show them what it was like to be a farmer. Most of her audience were urban people in China, and they really didn't get a lot of exposure to nature. So, like I mentioned before, when Lama and her father would go up into the mountains, it was a lot of hard physical labor. So they had to drag wood around, digging for the herbs is hard. You have to dig down in the ground with your bare hands and build shelters to sleep in for multiple nights. That Lamo had to take care of food. So a lot of her videos would show what she was cooking out there in the wild.
今晚上炒个鸡蛋吃，补充一下体力。本来白天很累，挖药的时候，好吃哦。明天就要下山了，今晚上我有煮了面条，你们看，在高山上我特别喜欢吃这个面条，味道还刚刚的，真的特别的好吃。特别的好吃。朋友们，吃晚饭了，今晚上做的是面条，你们看，锅里面还煮着，还有老干妈，你们看，就这样。朋友们，吃饭罢了，各有各的吃法哦。我的吃法是这样的，用舌头舔一舔。
Lama was also a huge fan of this self-heating pork and rice dish. So she would buy this at the store and take it up into the mountains with her, and she just devoured it. She loved this stuff. And in one of her videos, she's showing off the pork and rice dish, and she says, "Life is really good today."
在野外能吃上这样的盒饭就很不错了。 就像吃到了城市中的大餐一样。反正在野外特别的饿，不知道是为什么。
By the fall of 2020, Lamo had over 200,000 followers. They absolutely loved her, not just for the scenery and the farming, but also because she was so natural. So, this was around the time when people were getting really tired of the perfectionism that's on Instagram, and they were looking for something a little bit more casual and realistic. And that's exactly what they got with Lamo. She's just having lots of fun. She's not wearing a bunch of makeup. She's not really trying to be too glamorous, although I would argue that her Tibetan clothing is one of the most glamorous things I've ever seen. The sad thing was that people would write her comments and she could barely read any of them. One of the comments said this: "A simple, kind, and beautiful girl. There is no complaint about the hardships in life in those videos. There is only the smile on her face and the light in her eyes." Another thing that people really adored about Lamo was how humble she was. For example, her thumb and index fingers were permanently black from digging for herbs. And she told her followers, "I have the face of a 30-year-old and the hands of a 50-year-old. Don't criticize me for my hands. I use them to make money." Of course, none of Lamo's followers knew what was going on at home and how bad her home life was. And you can just see in these videos, in almost all of them, she's trying to be so happy, and she just wants to forget about this horrible abuse that her husband is putting her through. She did post a couple of sad videos, and I'm sure I can guess what those were related to. One of the few people who actually did try to help Lamo was one of her cousins. This cousin lived in a larger city that was nearby, and he or she, I'm not sure which, offered Lamo a job cooking barbecue there. But Lamo wouldn't take it because, first of all, she was afraid that she wouldn't get to see her two boys. And secondly, she didn't want to be away from nature. This is how she grew up. She loved being out in nature, and she didn't want to trade that for an urban environment. In May 2020, during the coronavirus lockdown, Tong actually picked up a new productive hobby, which was online poker. So one night, Tong was playing poker online, everybody was stuck at home, and he lost this poker game. And he got so angry that he picked up a bench and hit Lamo in the arm with it. And it either broke or dislocated her arm. I read both. Maybe both are possible, I'm not sure. I'm not a physician. But yes, this was the worst abuse yet that Tong had done to Lamo, and she was completely shocked. Oh yeah, and he also broke her phone. Her only escape, her outlet to the world, he just broke it. He probably knew how important it was to her. So right after this happened, Lamo took their younger son, who was 4 years old at this point, and ran to her father's house, and Dolma just happened to be there. And Dolma noticed at this point that Lamo had bruises all over her face and neck, like she had never seen before. And Lamo's little son, who again was 4 years old, said to Dolma, "Auntie, father beats mother." So Lamo filed for divorce immediately, just as soon as she could, because now she was afraid that Tong would actually beat her to death. Now, for some reason, Tong actually agreed to this divorce, and it was fine. So there was a court hearing about this divorce, and Dolma went with Lamo, and when they were reading the divorce agreement, it mentioned domestic violence. And that was when it really dawned on Dolma what was happening to her sister, because she really didn't understand up until that point that this was happening all the time. So with the children, Lamo got custody of the younger son, and Tong took custody of the older son, who was in school by now. So a few days after the hearing, once Lamo and Tong were actually officially divorced, Tong came back to Lamo's father's house and did his whole routine again. He got down on his knees, he begged for forgiveness, he promised Lamo that he would never do this again, and he loved her, and he really wanted her to remarry him. And by this point, Lamo had had it with this routine. She was just not having it, and she just didn't react at all. And when Tong saw that, it made him so angry that he grabbed their younger son, who again was 4 years old, held a knife to his throat, and said that he was going to kill him if Lamo didn't remarry him. And not only that, but then he turned around and tried to choke Lamo. And he made some other threats too. He threatened to break one of their son's legs, or maybe both of them. And then as he was leaving, he took both boys with him and threatened to drown them both in the river. So Lamo already knew that the police weren't going to do anything about Tong. So this time, she tried a different government agency called the All China Women's Federation. And they exist to help women, particularly with these domestic violence issues. So she went to them as soon as she could, but they turned her away. They told Lamo that her situation really wasn't that bad, and other women had it worse, so they would not be able to help her. After the Women's Federation turned Lamo down, she felt like there was nothing she could do. Nobody would help her. Her family wouldn't really help her. The government wouldn't really help her. And she was terrified not only for her own life, but for the lives of her boys. And so, reluctantly, she remarried Tong just to keep him from hurting or killing her sons. Of course, within 10 days of them remarrying, Tong beat Lamo twice more. Horribly. He beat her almost to death both times. And so, of course, she went back to her father's house to recuperate. So, of course, again, we're seeing lots of patterns here. Tong went back to Lamo's father's house and tried to get Lamo to come out and to give him their younger son, and she wouldn't do it. So he left and came back with his entire family to try to take back her younger son. So at this point, Lamo is even more scared because now he's got his whole family coming over to her sacred space, the only safe-ish place she has to go. She realized that she was no longer safe there in reality, and she started living with other relatives for a week at a time, or even a few days at a time. These were kind of extended relatives that Tong didn't know. He didn't know them, and he didn't know where they lived. And she was doing this, of course, to hide from Tong so that he couldn't come and find her. And the whole time, of course, Tong was sending all these threatening text messages about how he was going to hurt their sons or kill their sons if Lamo didn't come back to him. So this time, since Tong couldn't find Lamo, he started looking for Dolma. And Dolma was working at a store downtown. I think Lamo actually worked there sometimes too, but not during this particular period, because she was trying to hide from Tong. Tong came and asked Dolma where Lamo was, and Dolma told Tong that she didn't know. And so Tong left, so she thought everything was going to be fine. But then 10 minutes later, Tong comes back with his cousin and punches Dolma in the left eye so hard that it breaks her eye socket. Dolma obviously was completely shocked and in horrible pain. So she started running from shop to shop trying to get somebody to help her. And no one would help her because they were so scared of Tong and his family. So Dolma ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks recovering from this injury that Tong gave her. Her family had called the police, and they did stop and question Tong, but they just let him go. But Dolma's family kept asking the police to do something more. And so finally, they gave him a fine. Gosh, I'm sure that'll stop him. But they not only fined him, they fined Dolma too. They fined each of them $47. They said that Dolma was getting fined because she actually fought back a little bit. Dolma actually had to sue the Public Security Bureau to get them to drop this fine, which they eventually did. Gosh, that was just so nice of them, wasn't it? So after this incident where Tong injured Dolma, Lamo was even more terrified than she had been before, and she became determined to get divorced from Tong again. So she ran away from him again, and the whole time he was sending all his threatening texts, and Lamo was just not paying attention to these at all. She was totally ignoring him. Now, at the end of June, there was another court hearing to determine the custody of the boys. And even though some of her relatives offered to go with Lamo, for some reason she wanted to go by herself. I'm not sure if she was scared of them getting involved, like they might become targets just like Dolma had, or if this was just something she wanted to handle on her own, or both, or neither. But Lamo went to this court hearing by herself. And she was completely devastated when the court said that custody of both sons was going to the Tong family. Lamo called her sister Dolma immediately, and she was just absolutely hysterical. She could not believe that the court gave Tong custody of both their sons. Dolma made the comment that she thought it was just because the Tongs had more money. So, hearing this, Lamo formulated a new plan in her mind. And she was going to make more money. If that's what the court wanted to see, then she would get that done. She could do it. So at this point, she became extremely frugal. She would not spend money on anything. And she would go up in the mountains to look for herbs with her father. And she worked even harder than she had before. So she was up there all the time. The only exception to this was when she was allowed to see the boys once a month. And during that one time a month, she would actually take them to an amusement park and let them do whatever they wanted. They could eat whatever they wanted. She just really wanted them to have a great time with her. So that was the only time she spent any money. There was one other thing that she spent money on, and this is so sad, but she also bought books for the boys because she was terrified that they would grow up to be illiterate like she was. Lamo's obsession with making money was also becoming more of a thing in her videos. People noticed that she started talking about money more in her videos, but of course they still didn't know why. Also during this time, Tong left a comment on one of her videos that was later deleted, and it said, "When you come down from the mountain, we will solve this problem." On September 12th, 2020, Lamo posted a video saying that she was going home. She spent the whole summer working as hard as she could, and she needed a little bit of a break. So she came down from the mountains. And at this point, Lamo had finally been away from her husband, her abuser, for over 2 months now, and she was feeling great. It was the first time in her adult life that she'd been away from this abuse for any amount of time. Unfortunately, though, that happiness and optimism wouldn't last long. At 8 p.m. on September 14th, 2020, Lamo was live streaming on TikTok from her father's kitchen. Her father, Saburo Gia, was asleep in his bed. What Lamo didn't know was that Tong was riding his motorcycle halfway up the mountain to her house, and he was carrying 2 knives, one long one and one shorter one, and a humongous canister of gasoline. Right in the middle of her live streaming, Lamo's viewers saw a man come in on the background, and Lamo screamed. Then the camera went black. Tong stabbed Lamo 8 times. He then held one of the knives to her throat, poured or sprayed gasoline all over her, and set her on fire with a lighter. And not only did he set Lamo on fire, but he sprayed gasoline all over the first floor of Saburo Gia's house and set the whole thing on fire, too. Luckily, Saburo Gia heard Lamo scream, and he woke up and managed to get out of the house. And then one of their neighbors called an ambulance. But at this point, Lamo already had burns on 90% of her body. So, Lamo's father, Saburogia, rode in the ambulance with her, and she told him two things. First, she said that Dolma would take care of him. And second, she said that when they got to the hospital, she wanted Saburogia to tell the doctors to inject her with something so that she would die because she was in so much pain and she couldn't take it. At 9 o'clock, someone called Dolma. Dolma hadn't been watching the live stream and she was somewhere else, maybe at her own house. And they told her what happened. And she immediately chartered a car to take her to the hospital. By the time Dolma got to the hospital, it was 4 a.m., and she found her sister completely burned. She said that she looked like a piece of charcoal. And not only did she have burns on 90% of her body, but she was also diagnosed with hypovolemic shock, multiple organ failure syndrome, and severe dehydration. By this point, Lamo was in a coma. Meanwhile, after committing this gruesome act, Tong was actually too shaken up to ride his motorcycle, so he started walking down the mountain. And he stopped in a little store to get some water. But when he entered the store, the employees were completely shocked because he was also burned on 45% of his body, including at least part of his face. And of course, they knew something was up, so they called police, and the police just happened to be right there, and they arrested him in the little store. So, as the reality of this situation was starting to hit the family and hit Dolma, they realized that they were going to need a lot of money for Lamo's medical treatment. So they started a fundraiser on some kind of platform. It's like a version of GoFundMe. And they actually raised 1 million yuan in 7 hours. This was 3 days after the incident. 1 million yuan is a little over 150,000 US dollars. So Dolma became the main contact for Lamo's care, and a lot of the relatives were urging Dolma to just let Lamo go. They knew that she would never be the same, and they felt like they were just prolonging her suffering by putting her through all this medical treatment. But Dolma was just determined to save her sister. She said that as long as Lama was still breathing, she would do anything to keep her alive and keep her treated. Now, as for Lamo's father, Saburogia, he went into a catatonic state. He would not respond to people who were trying to talk to him. What he did was just sit there on his phone, watching Lamo's TikTok videos over and over and crying. Dolma would sometimes find her father out wandering around in the middle of the night aimlessly. This just completely broke him. Poor Saburogia, he was already sick before this happened, and he'd lost his wife. And to have this happen to his daughter just about did him in. On September 27th, which was 13 days after the incident, Lamo's nurse noticed that she actually opened her left eye a little bit. And as soon as she saw that, she called Dolma so that Dolma could talk to Lamo. So Dolma answered and spoke to Lamo. She said whatever she could think of that was soothing and kind. She just wanted Lamo to hear her voice to try to make her feel better. And Lamo couldn't respond because she had a tube down her throat. But the nurse noticed that as Dolma was speaking to Lamo, there were tears slowly streaming out of her left eye. After that, Lamo fell back into her coma. At this point, doctors started letting Dolma know that the 1 million yuan that they had raised, which had seemed like so much money, was not going to even come close to being enough to pay for Lamo's medical care. Lamo needed to be in the ICU for 2 to 3 more months, and she also needed 10 skin grafts. And the cost of all of this was going to be about 4 million yuan. And just as Dolma was starting to think about how she would raise the rest of this money, on September 30th, 2020, Lamo died of her injuries. She was just 30 years old. Lamo's funeral was held at a Buddhist temple in town, and her body was cremated. Dolma and Saburogia scattered her ashes in the river near their village, the same river that Lamo loved to go to. The day after Lamo's death, Xi Jinping, the president of China, was actually giving a speech at the United Nations. He told the UN, "The protection of women's rights and interests must become a national commitment." People in China were absolutely outraged at Lamo's death. They took this opportunity to jump all over Xi Jinping, start pressuring him to enforce their domestic violence law better. So the domestic violence law in China had actually only passed in 2016. So people were writing about this on Weibo. Weibo is like the Chinese version of Twitter. And they were talking about the need for enforcement of this law, and they were using the hashtag Lamo Act. But unfortunately, within one day, hashtag Lamo Act was censored on Weibo. Another thing that people were outraged about was that China had just passed this law in 2020 that required that couples have a 30-day cooling off period before they could get divorced. Critics of this law argued that it was dangerous and it was going to keep people in abusive relationships for far longer than was necessary. And actually, a lot of them wanted a different law. They wanted a law that would automatically grant a divorce to anyone whose spouse threatened them, either physically or verbally, so that they wouldn't have to go to court over it. People started calling Lhamo the perfect victim because not only had she gone to multiple agencies for help, but she was completely financially independent from Tong. She never depended on Tong for money. After she died, Lhamo got over 700,000 followers, and her videos as of right now are still up. And as I was gathering them for this video, they just made me so happy. You know, I completely understand why she was so loved on TikTok, but it just really broke my heart knowing what was going to happen to her. Dolma announced after Lamo's death that she intended to fight for custody of the two boys from the Tong family. In addition to all this, there was another problem, which was that Saburo Jia's house was now unlivable. There was just one little part of the first floor of the house that was not completely destroyed, and the family made a little shrine for Lamo there.
今天是中元节，也是我们葬礼的15。我和爸爸回来点灯，好让我妹妹也安心，我们也好给她一个交代。我在这里谢谢你们。
So the local government told Saburo Jia that he could live in this abandoned nursing home in town because it was there and nobody else was there, so why not? But he only had 2 rooms and there was no running water in this nursing home. There's also no toilet. So Saburo Jia, who, like I said, was already sick and not doing very well before this happened, has to go outside anytime he needs water and fill up a basin with mountain spring water and give himself a little bath. And anytime he wants to use the bathroom, he has to go across the yard and use a dry toilet there. There's not enough space in this place because when Saburo Jia's family comes over, they all have to sit on his bed, and so he doesn't get to use his bed very much. And he also had to turn the bedroom into kind of a makeshift kitchen. So there's a cutting board at the end of the bed, and the wardrobe that's supposed to be used for clothing, he had to turn into a kitchen cupboard. Dolma actually moved in with him because she didn't want him to be alone.
今天2审已经开庭了，然后拍这个视频呢，我就是想告诉
And they only eat what he's gathered in the mountains, which is a lot of mushrooms. I'm getting all of this information from an article that came out in September 2021, where a reporter from the China Digital Times went and visited the family. So they saw Saburo Jia's living conditions. Understandably, Saburo Jia is still extremely traumatized by what happened, and he really can't speak. So he can only communicate with people in very simple simple words. He'll say things like sit and eat, but he won't converse with them. And most of the time, he sits on a plastic stool against the wall, reciting Buddhist prayers. The local government told Saburo Jia that he could have a small piece of land near his brother's house if he agreed to demolish the old house, which he did. So upon hearing this, the whole family pooled all their savings and spent all of it on secondhand materials to build Saburo Jia a new house. And that was mostly secondhand stones. This is so heartbreaking, but after they spent all of their savings on these housing materials, the local government turned around and told Saburo Jia that he couldn't have the land after all because they were going to build a bridge there instead. In response to this, Saburo Jia said that he was grateful to the government for what he did have and that he didn't want to cause any trouble. He's still living in the abandoned nursing home today. However, that hasn't stopped him from being afraid because apparently at one point, Tong's younger brother said something that Saburo Jia felt was very threatening, and now he's afraid that the Tongs are going to come kill him too. Saburo Jia has said that his plan for the future is to buy a tent and live in front of one of the government buildings in town because he'll feel safer there. I really wish that I could help Saburo Jia, and I don't know how. So if anyone out there watching is familiar with fundraising in China or knows some way that I could start a fundraiser for him and actually get him the money, please leave a comment. I would love to talk to you about it. On October 14th, 2021, Tong was sentenced to death for the murder of Lamo. The court said that his crime was extremely cruel. This reignited people on Weibo again who were calling for more changes to laws, just like they had after Lamo died. There was one comment on Weibo that basically said the term domestic violence shouldn't even exist because a homicide is a homicide and a murder is a murder, and what's the difference between a regular murder and a domestic violence murder? There's really not one. And that comment got over 24,700 likes on Weibo. Yet another completely heartbreaking aspect of this story is that even though Saburo Jia and Dolma are supposed to get to see Lamo's two sons once a month, they haven't even seen them since the day before they scattered Lamo's ashes in the river. They are so afraid of the Tongs that they don't even dare to ask them to see the boys. And of course, both Saburo Jia and Dolma, like I said, are still traumatized, and this reporter I mentioned actually took them to their old house, which hasn't been demolished yet. At least it hadn't been as of this past September 2021. And both of them completely broke down in tears. According to Saburo Jia and Dolma, the Tongs have never apologized to them or offered to help them in any way. Now, this reporter who went out there to visit, so he or she, it doesn't say, took a cab out there to their tea house. And first of all, the cab driver was terrified. He didn't want them to see his license plate, so he actually parked 100 meters away from the tea house, and the reporter just walked the rest of the way. So Tong's mother did let the reporter in and made him or her a cup of tea, but she refused to do an interview. Tong's father was there too, and they did chat a little bit. They said that they were trying to move on in their lives for the sake of the two boys. They also said that they had no idea that Tong was abusing Lamo that whole time. Dolma says that she still intends to fight for custody of the boys. But I think right now she's still just too shocked to even think about how she might be able to do that. Dolma said that when her sister Lamo is reincarnated, she hopes she will be born into a world free from pain and domestic violence. And that's where the case stands as of today. I am so completely heartbroken over this case. Like I said, I wish I could give you a silver lining. I wish I could tell you anything positive about this case, but it's just tragic all the way around. This should never have happened. Lamo deserves so much better than what she got. And I really hope that this case has pushed China in the direction of actually enforcing their domestic violence laws. Domestic violence is not a family problem. It's not something for somebody to solve on their own. It's violence. It's assault. It's just like if you were out on the street and a random person assaulted you. That's illegal. This is also illegal. Both of them require police intervention. And Tong should have been locked up a long time ago, not just for what he did to Lamo, but how he threatened his boys, too. I absolutely cannot believe the government didn't even seem to care about that. It's like they're in denial. Like, they're thinking, well, I would never do that, so I'm sure this guy would never do that either. But that's not true. This happens all over the world, all the time. This is a serious worldwide issue, and every government on Earth needs to take it seriously. I'm so sorry to leave you on that sad note, but that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts if you want to leave a comment. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe so that you won't miss any of my upcoming videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.